didn't turn it out.
I turned it on. Yeah. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Schos. Testing. 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 Testing.
Is it on?
It is on. I believe it's on.
All right, so just off it.
Okay, perfect. Good. All right, we'll say good morning. A great schos Baruch Hashem to continue the week together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank the Dilson Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, annual Talmud Torah sponsor, for dedicating all the Shimon Drushos this year in the schos for Besoros Tovos Sha'am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Leinu Latova, Benny Goldberg, for Aliyas Neshama for his parents, Avram ben Asha Pinchas, Faker Razel Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that the Tefillah, Semir Hashem of our entire Kilo will be Niskabel on high this Elul and in the months ahead. Shmuel and Lieber Dinovitz, Le'ili Nishmas, Rabbi Ari Flum, Harav Yitzchak, Aryeh ben Hachaber, Rabbi Yaakov, father of David Flum. We hope that in merit Hashem of all of our tefillas. Oh, and our week of learning sponsors, David Goodman, Le'iloi Nishmas, Roi ben Aryeh Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families a Nechama. Merit Hashem, Chalish Baruch Hu should bring home all of our hostages, B'Shalom and Rekarv, allow our holy soldiers to be successful. Choma Seyyidayim, truly share B'Saros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael, the Merit Hashem this month and in the many months ahead. And of course, another special Mazel Tov to our Chav Reb Gedalia Rosenblum on the engagement of his son. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov to the brother of the Chassan, Reb Josh Rosenblum. Beautiful Simcha Baruch Hashem for the Mishwachish Bizochet Wach the Chassan down to the Chuppah. B'Shah Tova U'Mitzlachas. And with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, a really great daf ahead of us, as we, amazingly enough, make our way towards the end of Avoda Zara. So today's daf is Ayin Hey 75, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Dalid Amud Beis 74b. Where did we leave off? Okay, that was totally unhelpful. What was it? Wait, where? Dara Shrava?
Lines up 700.
Amr Mar. 7 lines. 2, 4, 6. Amarava. Perfect. Thank you. All right, well, say great. Thank you. Amarava. 7 lines are from the bottom. Thank you. Sefer Demas Nisin Ason Rabbanon. Good. Why should we end with that? Dara Shrava. Nava Arsaso. So the Gemara says as follows. So remember again, we've been talking about the use ultimately again of a kli, and in the event that, let's say, the kli has absorptions being used from an akum, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, how do you deal with that? So now Rabbi says something very interesting. Na'ava or saso. Now, what does this mean? If you look at Rashi, so Rashi is about 3 lines into the wide lines. Na'ava or saso. Hagat hirsicho baroschin. If you have a wine press, and ultimately, again, that press was used by an akum, and now you want to go ahead and utilize it, ultimately, again, for Jewish use, so you could scald it. Boiling water. If you put boiling water, ultimately, again, on the press, that'll go ahead and render it fit for use. Gemara says, Rava, kav meshader gulfim. So again, that's, now that halacha, I'm going to tell you coming attractions, because it's very exciting. On Amud Beis, Meretz Hashem is going to become the primary sugya of kashering. That's where we're going to see again how essentially when things go in, how do you get them back out? So hold on before we draw any conclusions. But again, Rabbi introducing this idea that essentially if you scald the press, ultimately renders it fit for use. Rava, this is just a side point because we just mentioned Rava. Kav mishader gulfi laharpanya. When Rava would go ahead and send, or we'll say gulfi are empty jugs, earthenware jugs. When he would send empty earthenware jugs to Harpanya, that was a place. What would he do? Now remember again, when it comes to earthenware, there's one thing we know about earthenware, which is highly absorbent. So you got to be careful with it. So now Rav is sending empty earthenware jugs to Harpanya. He wants to make sure that they don't get used for anything that's going to render them problematic during the course of their journey. So what would he do? Listen to this. Gemara says, Sachav lu'apumayu. So he would turn the jugs upside down in their bag. Right? So in other words, instead of having right side up, meaning the top of the jug, the opening of the jug sitting upward, he would turn them upside down. And he would go ahead and literally like wrap the opening of the bag. So this essentially was a double simon, right? A double simon. Number one, the jugs were placed in an unusual way, top down, right? So, or bottom up, ultimately again, and then the outside of the bag was actually sealed as well. So this double siman was enough to ensure that the akum would not tamper with the jugs when they were being transported. Kasavar, kol davar shemachniso lekiyum, afil lefi shag goes to be rabbanan. So remember again, remember again, the Gemara talked about the difference between, let's say, jugs and a wine press. What's the difference? Wine press is used episodically. Stuff doesn't sit in there, as opposed to jugs where items are ultimately kept in there for a longer duration. So because of that, that's why the jugs have a bigger issue in terms of taste infusion. Right? So therefore, again, Rava felt that halacha l'maisa, once you know that things are used for a longer duration, Chazal were gozer on them even for episodic use. So Imam and Akva, so now we go back to the beginning of this sugya. Remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah spoke about this idea that if you have a wine press, essentially, what was the issue with the press? The issue with the press is that the press was often sealed with pitch. Pitch apparently has a little bit of a negative odor. How do you take care of the negative odor of the pitch? You mix in wine, which is fine if it's a Jew that's doing it, but if it's an akum that's doing it, we have a little bit of an issue. So therefore, the Mishnah spoke about the idea that halacha l'maisa, how do you deal with this? So the Mishnah spoke about three different types of presses. There was a press that was made, a wine press that was made out of stone. And again, the Gemara said that halacha l'maisa, just wipe it down. Menagva. If it's made out of wood, Rebbe says wipe it down. Chacham say you have to peel off the sealant. And ultimately, again, if it's made of earthenware, everyone agrees can't be used. So now the Gemara asks the $1 million question: when we say wipe it down, what does that mean? What exactly is that process of wiping it down? It's very interesting. So how do you go ahead and wipe down the press, rendering it fit for use? Rav Amar b'mayim. Rav says you just wipe it down with water. Rabbi Bar Chana Amar be'efer, with ash. You essentially scrub it down with ash. So Gemara says, 1 second. Rav Amar b'mayim v'lo be'efer. Rabbi Bar Chana Amar be'efer v'lo b'mayim. So it's strange. So is Rav saying you only use water and not ash? And again, is Rabbah saying you only use ash and not water? Ella, Rabosai Tapavayin Hey, 75a. Rav Amar b'mayim v'hu din le'efer. Rav Chana Amar li'efer v'hu din le'mayim. Oh, ultimately, they both mean, Rabosai, what's involved in the quote-unquote wiping down process? Both water as well as ash. So you scrub it with ash, you wash it down with water. And the Gemara says, and interestingly enough, velo pligi, they're actually not even arguing. Why? They're talking about two different type of presses. Ha b'retivasa, ha b'yeveshta. One is talking about a press that is wet, and one is talking about a press that is dry. If the press is wet, ultimately, again, the first thing you do is you apply the ash, scrub out the moisture, then wash it down with water. If the press is dry, then the process ultimately again begins with water. But I will say, the process ultimately again of readying the press. Remember again, I want to point out, this is a very specific case of a press that was treated with a sealant, right? The issue over here is that the wine mixed in with the sealant. So now again, you have to wipe it down. How do you wipe it down? Essentially, ash and water. Which one comes first? Depends on what the status of the press is. If the press is wet, start with the ash first, then go to water. If the press is dry, start with the water and then go to ash. Interesting. Itmar Beirav Mishmei Rav Amri Tarti Tlas. Since in the yeshiva of Rav, the Sinim of Rav, sometimes the way to go ahead and ready the press for Jewish use requires 2 steps. Sometimes it requires 3 steps. Now, what does Rabbi say? So here's what's interesting. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Tarti tlas, beritivasa, tarti, efer mayim, biaveshta tlas mayim, efer mayim. Rabbi say what Rav is introducing is as follows. At the end of the day, in order to ready the press for use, you're going to have to do a final wash down with water. So sometimes the kashering process is 2 steps. Sometimes it's 3 steps. How so? So if it's dry, it's going to be 3 steps. Water, ash, water. If it's wet, it's going to be 2 steps, just ash and water. Okay, and I will say, so we're going to see essentially some of this machlokes. Well, let's see. Shmuel says tlas dalid. Shmuel says no. Sometimes the kashering process is 3 steps, and sometimes it's 4. How so? Again, so Rashi points out over here, if halacha l'maisa, if the press is wet, so it's going to be again ash, water, ash. Ultimately, again, if it's dry, then it's going to be water, ash. Well, and we'll see again water, ash. Besura masnuhachi, pabadisa masnuhachi, beiravar mishmei derav, tlas dalid. Ushmol Amar Dalid Hey. So again, here's what's interesting about this. Everyone is agreeing halacha l'maisa that it's the same ingredients for the wiping down process. What are the ingredients, or what are the pieces? Water and ash. Gemara says, "V'lo pligi mar kachashev maya basrai umar lo kachashev maya basrai." So here's what's interesting. The issue is after the ash, you're going to have to apply water. Now, why do you need water after the ash? Why? To go ahead and remove the ash. So the machlokes Rav and Shmuel is that last application of water considered to be part of what we'll call the hadacha, or the menage, part of the wiping down experience, or ultimately, again, just a utilitarian step in removing ash? Okay, so that's the machlokes. That's why one calls it a 3-step process, not counting the last water. One calls it a 4-step process, counting the last water. Good. Bottom line, what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? That ultimately, again, if you have a wine press that was sealed by an akum, and again, remember what I want to point out over here, we're talking about also wine presses that were never really used by the akum, right? The issue over here is just the sealant, not the usage. Now you want to render it fit for use, ultimately, again, for a Jewish press, for a Jewish wine press, no problem. Minagvan, what's involved in minagvan? Wiping it down both with water and ash. How much water, how much ash? That's going to depend ultimately, again, on the state of the press. Incredible. Hani gurgi da'aramoi mai. So what's the interesting case over here? What's the status of this gurgi da'aramoi? Now, what is this? If you look at Rashi, it's the last line of the intermediate wide lines, right before the lines get really wide. Gurgi akolim ubalaz yufsusi v'karchin osas vivos hatapuach shelo yispazu ha'anavim mikover akor. Okay, so both sides. So remember again, you have a wine press. What do you have in a wine press? Number one, you have grapes, right? Number two, the press itself is made up of multiple parts, but on the most basic part, how do you press the grapes? You go ahead and you place a board on top of the grapes, right? And you apply pressure to the board that squeezes it. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that the grapes themselves don't scatter. So what would they put on top of the grapes? Some type of netting, some type of mesh netting to keep the grapes together. So the Gemara says that's called gurgi daramai. Rashi has a second girsa afterwards, but let's just go with this. Gurgi daramai mai. So in other words, what happens if you have a gurgi daramai from an akum? If the akum used it, now can I use that ultimately again for my grapes? Listen to this. Samar brings a raya, interestingly enough, from not the laws of Yayin Nesach, but interestingly enough, the laws of Tuma and Tara. So let's say a person ultimately, again, his wine press, base badov, his olive press, became Tameh. Ubikesh lasos Tara, and now he wanted to purify them. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Hadapin v'ha'adashin v'halulavin madichin. So certain items, daf for both sides, daf is the board, right? Adashin, lulavim are like the brooms that you use to get scattered grapes or scattered olives. Madichan, all you need to do is rinse that off. Just rinse that off and you're good to go. Ha'akalin shal mitzarim v'shal bitzputz, the netting, so whether it's made of reeds or other types of materials, minagvan. All you need to do ultimately again is, now I'll say minagvan is that lashon we had before, sounds like wipe it down. V'shal shifa v'shal gemi, but if it's made out of some type of reed, ultimately again, meyashnon yud beis chodesh. We let it sit unused for 12 months. Now I'll say, by the way, this is going to be very important because we will see this concept that sometimes for kashering, time is all you need. Miyashnon yud beis chodesh. Rabbi says, no, manichan migat legat or mibad lebad. Essentially, you let it sit unused from one pressing season to the next. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, Hainu Tanakama. So Rabbi Shmuel seems to be saying the same thing as Tanakama. Tanakama said, don't use it for a year. Rabbi Shmuel says, don't use it from one pressing season to another pressing season. Bepashtos, how much time is there between pressing seasons? A year. Bepashtos. So aren't they saying the same thing? Ikubenayu chorfi va'afli. No, sometimes it happens. Just the way the harvests work out. Sometimes you could go from one harvest or one pressing to the next pressing. There's an earlier crop, a later crop. So sometimes it's not exactly a year. Rabbi Yossi says, Harotz l'taron. If you want to be metaher, again, I will say, in this case over here, my wine press and all its accessories, or my olive press and its accessories became tameh. Now I want to make it tar. What do? Magilan beroschin ocholtin b'meizesin. Literally, again, put it in boiling water, or pour boiling water on it, or choltin b'meizesin, or scald it with olive juice, which effectively is the same thing. Right? Scald it. So again, I will say, so that's what we will call later on. We'll know this process as hagala, kashering something with boiling water. Rabbi Shmuel says, Rabbi Yossi, manichan tachas tzinor shemeimav mekalchin. Place it underneath a faucet or a pipe that has constant flowing water. O b'mayon shemeimav rotfin, or by a stream that's water is flowing. The Gemara says, and put it there. The kama. How long do you have to leave it there? Ona. For an ona. We don't know how long an ona is, but we'll get to it. So I just want to point out, remember, why are we doing this? Because the Gemara was talking about this idea that if I went ahead and I went ahead and I got, let's say, a wine press and all the other pieces, all the other wine press accessories from an akum, so now what could I do with it? So the Gemara is trying to say, essentially, the process that one would use to go ahead and purify a wine press from tuma and tara, from tuma to tara, would effectively be the same process that the wine press would undergo to go from what we'll call, yayin nesech to ultimately, again, Jewish wine. That's what the Gemara says over here. So the Gemara says the same process we use for yayin nesech is the same process we use for tara. The Gemara says, one second, that doesn't make any sense. Klape laya, betaros kamina. The process we just outlined was the process ultimately, again, from tuma to tara. The Gemara says, you're right, Ella, kidera sham betaros, kach amru b'yayin nesach. This same process that we just outlined, ultimately, again, to bring a press, a wine press, an olive press, from tuma and its accessories, from tuma to tara, ultimately, again, will be the same process that you could use for yayin nesach. So therefore, I will say, ultimately, again, a little bit of a machlokes over here. What exactly do you need to do to move out the accessories and the press itself? But whatever the process works for tum tara, that is the same process, ultimately, again, that will work from yayin nesach to allow it to be used for Jewish use. The Gemara says, by the way, kama ona. So if you remember again, one of the things the Gemara said is one of the ways to go ahead and be matar everything is essentially leave it under flowing water for an ona. For an ona. What's an ona? I'm Rabbi Yochanan. O yom o laila. Either a day or a night. Now I'll say now, what is not 24 hours. What it means is a daytime period or a nighttime period. In other words, bepashtos, 12 hours. 12 hours. Now I'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara Rabbi Chana She'ina, Ba'amr le Rabbi Chana bar She'ina, Amra bar Chana, Amra Yochanan, Chatzi Yom v'Chatzi Laila. No, it's half the amount of a daytime period and half the amount of a nighttime period. Amr Shawar Yitzchak v'lo pligi, they're not arguing. Habit tekufas Nisan v'Tishrei, Habit tekufas Tammuz v'Teves. So I said, this is very interesting. During the times of Nisan and Tishrei, right, which during times of which essentially is like your fall and spring equinox, right? So ultimately, again, the days and nights are the same length, 12 hours, right? During ultimately Tammuz and Teves, which essentially is the summer and the winter, days and nights are not the same length. So bottom line, interestingly enough, what Ona means is 12 hours. That's an Ona. That's an Ona for 12 hours. Right? Ultimately, again, but sometimes you could just say a night Ona or a day Ona, and it's also 12 hours. Sometimes it's half a day, half a night, and that comes to a total of 12 hours. Okay, good. The Gemara says as follows. Amar Yehuda, Hani Revaki Daramai, Demazya Madichin, Da Amra Menagbens. Well, it's an interesting case over here. Take a look at Rashi. Ravaki Mishmeres Kimin Sakin, Shenostin Ben Shmar Lahosin Yena. So we'll say, so this is also like a netting. A netting. Mishmaris literally means like a sieve or a funnel. So this would be like a type of netting that you would put the crushed grapes in. Why would you put the crushed grapes in there? because there's still liquid. Even after you crush it in the press, you put like the grape pulp into this netting, and gravity does a lot of work, just allowing the wine to come out. So the shaila now is, if I have this type of netting from an akum, and now again, he's used it for his own wine, so now the shaila is, under what circumstances can I use it for me? So the Gemara says, Hani Ravaki Daramai, Demazia Madichin. Rashi says, Demazia, if it's made out of human hair. So sometimes it was common to make this type of netting out of human hair. So Madichin, all you need to do is simply wipe it down, rinse it off, and you're good to go. You're good to go. So apparently human hair wasn't considered to be a very absorbent material. So because that, just wipe it down, right, and you're good to go. Da'amra, if it's ultimately made out of wool, menagvan, ultimately, again, then you have to do this process of niguf, right? That requires a bit more of a drying out. The kisna, if it's made out of wool, miyashnon, you have to let it sit for a while. V'i'ika kitri sharlu. Now, if there's knots in the netting, then obviously part of the kosherization of the nets is undo the knots, right? Which makes sense, because if wine gets absorbed in the knots, you want to undo the knots. Fine. So Moses says, Hani dekuli v'chalsa da'aramoi. So ultimately, you're going to say, so these baskets over here, so these dekuli v'chalsa da'aramoi, so the Gemara says, dechiti, ultimately bechavli, ditsuri madichon. So Rashi says over here, bechavli ditsuri, chavalim shel tsuri dekel. So ultimately, again, if they're sewn together, bechavli ditsuri, with again these ropes of tsur, so the Gemara says, madichon, you just wipe it down. Again, so most of these are all just different materials that these utensils are made of. So madichon, wipe it down. Amud beis, ditzivsa lenagvon. If it's made, Rashi says, ditzivsan is min gemi, some type of reed. Ultimately, again, then you need the process of niguv. The kisna, if it's made out of wool, miyashnan, you have to essentially let it sit for a while unused. The isbu kitri, and if it has knots in it, sharilu, you have to undo the knots before going in and using it. Itmar, we'll say interesting case over here, and this will take us to the Mishnah. Itmar, ama aretz shahoshit yado legat, v'naga ba'ashkolos. Interesting case. And Amma Aretz. I'm going to say, what's the assumption in Amma Aretz? What's always the assumption? When the Gemara talks about an Amma Aretz, what's one of the determinants of an Amma Aretz? Tumantara, right? It's not about Tilchol Shabbos or things like that. Tumantara. An Amma Aretz is not makbid Tumantara. Which I will say, by the way, if you think about it, such a profound Musar Haskell. What is the greatest source of life ignorance? Or what is the greatest paradigmatic example of life ignorance? If you don't know what is tameh and what is tahar, then you're going through life blind. If I can't tell the difference between tuma and tara, then ultimately again, ein amaratzas, ein ignorance, gidola mizo. No one knows everything, but the most important things you need to know in life is what is tameh, what is tahar. What is good? What is bad? What is kosher? What is treif? What are the things I should be engaging in, and what are the things I should be distancing myself from? If I don't have enough awareness or enough knowledge to know that, then unfortunately, Chazal said, you're in bad shape. You know, if you don't know a lot of other stuff in Yiddishkeit, okay, you could learn it. But the inability to distinguish between that which is tameh, that which I don't even mean halachic tumah and halachic tara, but life tumah, life tara, then unfortunately, again, the Gemara says that's an Amma Aretz. So in this case, again, let's get back to the halacha, not the hashkafa. Amma Aretz, shahoshit yadol lagat. Here's the problem. I have a wine press. And Amma Aretz comes along, and he puts his hand in my wine press. Why? Why do people do a lot of things that they do, right? Why are you touching my stuff? Just why are you touching my stuff? Right? So again, but whatever. There's a famous story. The story actually has like a number of different versions of it, but one version of the story is that the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh was walking with his Talmud Mufak, the Maggid of Mezrich, and they were walking out just like in the fields in nature. So the Maggid of Mezrich was walking, and what did he do? Just not thinking, he pulled the leaf off the tree. So the Baal Shem Tov says, what are you doing? So Maggid said, Israel said, we do all the time. Like, I didn't even know what he was talking about. It's like, I'm walking into that, but what am I doing? It's like, no, what are you doing? What are you doing? So, and then the Maggid understood. He said, Rabbi, I just pulled a leaf off the tree. He said, that leaf has a tachlis in the world as well. That leaf has an avoda in the world as well, right? That leaf here is served to some purpose. You think it's just here for you to pluck it off? It has an avoda. And I always thought like there's two tremendous lessons from that story. Remember when the Baal Shem Tov was teaching his Talmud? Mindfulness. Mindfulness. You see, if you're walking, you just pluck something off without thinking, the problem is right there. I did something without thinking. A Yid never should do something without thinking. The entire avoda of a Yid is to live with mindfulness. So everything I do, again, there's a kavana. It doesn't mean I don't make mistakes. But lamaisa, again, there's a kavana, there's a mindfulness. That's lesson one. Lesson two is that everything in this world has a purpose. It's not just us. Everything in this world has a purpose. And lesson number three, even the leaves, right? Even the leaves, everything has a tachlis in avodas Hashem. I remember as a child, I'm sure I shared this. My grandmother, Zichrono Livracha, my grandparents, when they came to this country after the war, they went to the Bronx a little bit, and then they went to Vineland, New Jersey. My grandfather was a chicken farmer in Vineland, New Jersey. So they had acres and acres of land. By the time we were little already, they sold off most of it. They only had like 10 acres, But they had. So summertime, we never really went to camp. We just went to Vineland, New Jersey, which was much better. And I remember when it used to storm, my grandmother would take us outside, and she would say, look at the trees. And they were swaying. She said, the trees are davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was the most beautiful and profound thing. To this day, my kids know it also, to this day, whenever it's windy, I always find myself mesmerized by the trees. Mamish always watching them daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's such a beautiful imagery. But again, that's what Baal Shem Tov was saying to the Maggid also. Everything davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a song of tefillah that all of nature sings. Don't get in the way of nature. Let nature do its thing. This is not like a tree hugging drasha. I'm just saying, sometimes we're both like, we kind of become, as human beings, become like a little bit self-centered, that it's all about us. Everything in this world has its tachlis and avodas Hashem. In any event, bottom line, don't touch other people's stuff, right? That's the takeaway. So the Amaris comes along, he touches my grapes. He touches a cluster of grapes. Now, obviously, what we're talking about over here is the clusters are in the press. So what happens? So the Gemara says, now the shaila is, Rabbi Chia Chad Amar Eshkal V'Chol Siyoset Mein. So I'll say it's machlokes. Now, what's the status of the grapes in the press? So one opinion said that cluster, and ultimately again, everything immediately around that cluster are all tamei. The chalagat kula Torah. But the good news is the rest of the press is tar. So essentially, the cluster and the immediate surrounding clusters, problematic. Everything else is going to be tar. The Chadam, the other one said, Kalagat kula nami tamei. The other opinion said, no, everything in the press is tamei. Oh, okay, so both say, so that's pretty dramatic. So according to the first opinion, that said that Allah Lamaisa again, it is only the actual cluster that was touched, and the surrounding clusters are tamei, but the rest of the vat is tahar. What about the following case? If you find a sheretz, if you find a dead rodent in the olive press, ultimately, again, it's only metame, the place where of contact. But if there was olive oil flowing in the press, then ultimately, again, everything in there is tamei. So both say, interestingly enough, why is it that by the olive oil, everyone agrees that everything is tamei, but yet again, by the wine press, there's this opinion that says that it's only we'll call it the cluster of contact and the immediate surrounding clusters that are tamei. To which the Gemara says, very simple, Hasam lo mifsak velo midi, hacha mifsaki eshkolos. Both say there's a very big difference. In the olive oil case, when there's oil, the oil kind of brings everything together, makes it into one mass. By the clusters, there's individualized clusters. So you could see that someone would say it is only the contact of cluster and the immediate surrounding clusters that will be tamei, but everything else remains tar, as opposed to in the olive press where there's oil everywhere, the oil is going to combine everything. The Gemara says, Orule Rabbanan Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Amrulei Lebrei Rabbi Yirmiyah Kedivrei Omer Eshkol v'Chol Sevivos of Tmein v'Chalagat Kula Torah. So we'll say, so ultimately again, The Rabbanan paskin, like the first opinion, that when the Ama Aretz touches the cluster of contact is tamei, the surrounding clusters are tameim, but the rest of the vat ultimately again will be turnable. Now we must be talking about also over here a vat that is not obviously flowing with wine, right? Because if it's flowing, in other words, there could be some wine on the bottom over there, but if it's flowing with wine, then it's like the olive oil case. So it must be a case of where the clusters themselves might be some wine on the bottom, but not submerged in wine. Incredible. Now we come to the last Mishnah in the Masechta. Incredible. Our last Mishnah. And this, by the way, get ready. This is going to be such a fun sugya. This is great stuff. Halacha l'maisa. We're going to have to find the opportunity in Miras Hashem to be able to go ahead and have a share together as well on these sugyas. So here we go. Mishnah. Get ready for this. So now, I'm sorry, no more yayin nesach. No more yayin nesach, right? You have your fill of yayin nesach. Again, we'll have yayin nesach in a little bit, but now what we're doing is we are fundamentally entering into the laws of kashrus, specifically the laws of hechsher kelim, kosherization of utensils and vessels for Jewish use. Here we go. So watch this. I purchase a utensil from an akum, a used pot. I purchased a utensil from an akum. So as I say, now the shaila is, now again, if there's one thing that we have taken away from this entire sugya of yayin nesach, is that what? Is that utensils absorb. Utensils absorb. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, when I go ahead and I purchase a used utensil from an akum, I have to be aware that there are absorptions in that utensil. So the shaila is, what do I do about it? So watch this. So again, we'll have to see exactly what this means. So that which is normally immersed should be immersed. Now Rashi Silber, what does this mean? Look at Rashi in the Mishnah, first short line. So watch we're going to see that when you purchase a utensil from an akum, there are really two steps involved in rendering it fit for Jewish use. Number one is kosherization, which means extraction of any non-kosher absorptions that may be in that utensil. That's step one. After the utensil has been kosherized, then you require tvila, immersion in a mikvah. Immersion in a mikvah has nothing to do with absorptions. Immersion in a mikvah has to do that whenever a Jew acquires utensil, be it used or new, a Jew consecrates and inducts that utensil into his religious service. The beautiful thing is everything that a Jew does in this world is Avoda Hashem. It's all Avoda Hashem. Even my eating is Avoda Hashem. How do I show that? I get my utensils and what do? I bring them to the mikvah. Rabbi Shmuel is incredible. The same mikvah, right, that I use for Tuman Tara. Okay, today we have like a Kalim mikvah, right? But conceptually, it's the same thing. Conceptually, same mikvah. So the same mikvah that I use to take myself from a state of Tuman to Tara is the same mikvah that I put my utensils in, ultimately again, to ready them for Jewish use. Everything that a Yid does is a davar shebekdusha, is holy. Therefore, my utensils must be ready for consecrated use. The most incredible thing. So therefore, technically speaking, what the Mishnah is really opening up over here is if you have a utensil that doesn't have any absorption issues, whether because, let's say, it was only used cold, so it never absorbed, or it's brand new, all you need to do is take it to a mikvah and you're good to go. Next. Lahagil, yagil. If ultimately, again, it was used, now we'll talk about this. If, let's say, the utensil was used with boiling water, then ultimately, again, you kasher it with boiling water. Lalabin bar, yalbin bar. If, let's say, the utensil was used with fire, ultimately, again, you kasher it with fire. For example, hashipod va'askala, a spit or a skewer, malambin ba'ar, which I used with fire. So let's say I buy a spit or a skewer from an akum, right? So Bapashtas, he used it for his non-kosher meat. I kasher it with fire. Hasakin shafa v'hitahora. Ultimately, again, a knife. How do you kasher a knife? You rub it down. Well, we'll discuss exactly what this means. But you rub it down and it's tahar. So I'll say, so incredible. So now I'll say there's a lot to unpack over here. So let's go. So Tana, the kulot tzrich and tvila bar b'am sa. Now I'll say, again, every utensil that you use always requires tvila, immersion in the mikvah, a mikvah of 40 sa'ah. A mikvah of 40 sa'ah is just a bona fide mikvah. So we'll say, so again, remember, this is whether you're purchasing the utensil used or new. Again, process. If you're purchasing the utensil used, then step one is kosherization, kashering, and then immersion in a mikvah. If you're purchasing it new, you don't need kosherization, so therefore you just go straight to immersion in a mikvah. What type of mikvah? A mikvah 40 sa'ah, which I both say is just a regular mikvah. A regular mikvah. How do you know? How do you know that utensils require immersion in a mikvah? Like where do you get that from? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, the Amar Kra, Kol Davar Sheyavo Ba'esh Ta'viru Ba'esh Vitaher. Now, both say we're going to see, interestingly enough, the concept of kashering of utensils, right? The concept of kashering and then immersion all comes from the war with Midian. The war with Midian, it's fascinating. Klal Yisrael goes to war with Midian, and they come back, Baruch Hashem, with spoils of war. So Moshe Rabbeinu tells them, Chevra, before you use anything, you have to kasher it. So we're going to see, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Kol davar sheyavo ba'esh taviru ba'esh. Any utensil that was used, let's say, by the Midianites with fire, you have to kasher with fire. We're going to see that the method of kosherization mirrors the manner of usage. So and then it ends and it says, vitaher, and you should purify it. Now, we'll say that extra vitaher, that's an extraneous word. Hosif l'cha kosov tara acheres. The Torah adds on another purification process after kosherization. What's that additional purification process? We'll say, what is that? Immersion in mikvah. So the need to immerse your utensils in a mikvah comes from that extra word, vitaher. So the Gemara says, Hosif l'cha kosov tara acheres. Tani bar Kafra. Bar Kafra says, Midoch shenemar b'mei nida. Now the Torah says you have to immerse the item b'mei nida. Now mei nida usually means a mikvah. Shomei ani shetzarech hazah shlishi ushvi. So we'll say it's fascinating. I might have thought that the utensils require sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th days, just like someone who's tamei, right? Someone who's tamei tumas meis may require sprinkling on days 3 and 7. So I might have thought that a kli requires that as well. Tamalomar ach. Therefore, the pasuk uses ach. Every time you have ach is mechalik. It distinguishes. So in other words, that you don't need hazah and shlishi and shvi. Imkain, mat hamlar meinida. So why does the Torah say that you should go ahead and put the utensils b'meinida into waters of a nida? Why? Listen to this. Mayim shenida tovelas bahen. It means use the same waters that a nida uses. Have omer arba'im sa'ah. What type of waters does a nida use? Ultimately, again, a mikvah of 40 sa'ah. So just like a nida needs a mikvah 40 sa'ah, so too utensils require a mikvah of 40 sa'ah as well. So the Gemara says, and interestingly enough, if you notice, therefore, the Gemara is really giving us two derivations for the notion that utensils require immersion in a mikvah. Number one, vitaher, and number two, b'mei nida. The obvious question is, why do you need two? So I'll tell you why. You need both of these drashas. Why? If it would have just said vitaher, havamina vitaher, called duhu, I would have thought you just need to immerse it in some water. Doesn't need to be a mikvah 40 sa'ah. Any amount of water will do, and you're good to go. Therefore, again, the Torah says, kazav rachmana b'mei nida. Torah says b'mei nida, which teaches you what? No, it's got to be a bona fide mikvah 40 sa'ah. Because of rachmana b'mei nida, and if it would have just said made it very interesting, havamina herev shemesh kinida. We both say, remember again, in order for a woman to be tahar, what has to happen? Let's say, for argument's sake, you have a woman who's a nida who goes to the mikvah on day 7 of her 7 clean days. Right? What's the halacha? She's not tahora until when? Nightfall. So I might have thought that just like a nida requires nightfall, maybe kalim, after they go to the mikvah, also require nightfall. The Gemara says, kasav rachmana vitaher la'alter. Ultimately, again, therefore the pasuk says vitaher, which means no, as soon as you immerse the kalim in the mikvah, ultimately, again, they are tar. So we'll say, this is ridiculously exciting. This is probably the most exciting thing that has happened today so far, which is about to say, now we know the source for the concept of tevilas kalim. So if somebody asks you, you're walking out, by the way, how do you know that you have to immerse kalim in a mikvah, be them whether it's used or new? Oh, funny you should ask. We learn it out from the war with Midian. The Torah adds in the word taher and mei nida. Ultimately, again, in between those two, what do we learn? We learn that halacha l'maisa kelim, whether they're used or new, needs to be immersed in a mikvah. What type of mikvah? What type of mikvah? A regular bona fide 40 sa'ah mikvah. When do they become tar? Immediately upon immersion. Incredible. Let's go back to a little bit. Afilu kelim chadoshim b'mashma. Now, listen, interestingly enough, now here's what's fascinating. So remember, the halacha of tvilas kelim, right, of immersing your utensils in a mikvah, it's learned out from Midyan. In Midyan, what kind of utensils were they dealing with? What were they dealing with? Used utensils. But yet, interesting, Rabbi Nachman says in Rabbi Avua, the halacha for tvilas kelim is even new utensils. As we mentioned, the Gemara says, Daha yishanim velibnon kichadoshim damu va'afilu hachi by tvila. We'll say, what's the raya for this? This is fascinating. What is the status of a utensil after you kasher it? What's the status? What's the status? Like new. Like new. Right? It's halachically, it's just like new. Yet, what's the halacha? Even after you go ahead and you kasher the utensil, what do you have to do? Immerse it in a mikvah. Essentially, the halacha is saying like this. There is no difference between a utensil that has been kashered and a brand new utensil. They're the same thing. So just like you have to kasher, or just like you have to immerse a utensil, ultimately, again, that was kashered, so too, excuse me, so too, you have to go ahead and immerse a brand new utensil as well. Now, what I'll just mention, is that, remember, the order here is very important. Immersion could only occur after kashering. If you immerse and then kasher, you'd have to immerse again. Tvila can only be done on a quote-unquote new utensil, whether it's actually new or like new. So the order over here is very important. So Rav Shesha says, so if that's the case now, that you have to immerse Jewish utensils, listen to this. Afilu zuzi desar balanami. Maybe your pair of scissors. Now literally, zuzi desar balanami means like clothing scissors. In other words, maybe you should have to immerse everything. Everything. In other words, not just utensils for food, but why not immerse everything owned by a Jew? Gemara says, Amrale, Kles Udamurin beparsha. So again, it's because that's not the topic of Midyan. The topic of the parsha of Midyan ultimately is clear from the way that Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking to the Jewish people. He says anything that was used by fire, you put it in fire. Anything used with water, put it in water. So clearly Moshe Rabbeinu himself ultimately, again, is talking about utensils that were used in food preparation. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, those are the only types of food items or utensils that require both kashering and then immersion. One more piece of us, and then we'll stop for today. Rav Nachman, Rabbi Avua, lo shan el b'lekuchin k'maisa shaya aval she'ulin lo. And we'll say one last important piece of halacha. Furthermore, what does tvilas kelim apply to? It only applies to items you own. It does not apply to items you borrow. So if a Jew goes ahead and borrows an item from an akum, now again, if you borrow and you want to use it, you may still have to kasher it. But it does not require tvila. Tvilas kelim, immersion of utensils, is only on something that a Jew owns, not on something that a Jew borrows. Again, if you're borrowing a non-Jew's utensil and you're going to cook with it, use it, then again, you have to kasher it. You can't use it without kashering. But tvila, immersion of utensils in a mikvah, only on items owned by a Jew. I say much, right? Did I promise you exciting? Much more, not finished. Much more about this in tomorrow. A lot of great halacha l'maisa as well. I will say tomorrow, last day of Avoda Zara. Incredible. Stay tuned for details for our upcoming Siyum Emir Hashem. Have a great day. Everyone's have a great day, everyone.